Good morning, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, dear delegates. You might be a bit surprised to see me on the screen because this is not where I should be. I should be right here with you today in person, but that was not to be. In fact, I should have been with you last night, doing the things that you were up to last night with you. And I would have dearly loved to have done that. But as I said, unfortunately, it was not to be, but for very good reason. I wouldn't have, for anything other than a very good reason, would I have not been here with you today. And the good reason is that as we speak, you probably know it's the BRICS Summit happening. And today, very importantly, there is a meeting between President Ramaphosas and the President of China and a Chinese delegation, and I am part of that session. And you would very well know that the Chinese market is incredibly important to us, with enormous growth potential. So what I'm doing today is really on your behalf. Now, when I was invited to come to your conference, of course, I was very excited about it. And David told me that it would happen in a slightly different way. I wouldn't give a normal keynote address, but that there'd be a kind of a conversation with David, a sort of an interview with David on the stage. And that's what I would have done. As it happens, we're going to try and do that, but for that, I have to find David. And where on earth would I find this fellow? Well, probably the best place to look is, you guessed it, in the bar. Let's see if I can find him. David.
Morning, Minister.
I knew I'd find you here.
Great to see you. Great to see you.
Good to see you, man.
Should we go and have a chat?
Let's do that. Thank you.
Good stuff.
Thank you.
After you. Okay, guys, here we are. Minister, absolute treat and privilege as always to be with you. And really grateful to Belinda McIntyre and Soho Sun for hosting us. Really comfortable surroundings, 54 in Bath.
Great surroundings.
And just looking forward to having a chat. Obviously, we are going to focus on some of the current tourism issues. There have been some questions sent in by SATSA members that they are keen to put to you. But I thought, and this is really why I was keen to engage in this sort of more relaxed format, is to try and understand the person behind the minister. Schooled at Jan van Riebeeck in Cape Town, and you were telling me earlier, ended up on a farm in Magaliesburg, probably your first touch of tourism, selling produce to the brands at Mount Grace, and you were then arrested. But some of that, just your time, your journey from Jan van Riebeeck through to that time, which was obviously a really interesting and seminal time for our country's history.
It was, David, you don't plan and plot your life's journey. Things happen. But taking me all the way back to my Jan van Riebeeck days, actually before Jan van Riebeeck, I went to the German primary school, which was great because I learned to speak German, and that's still with me today. Jan van Riebeeck, people often make the assumption that that I must have been a misfit in the school and must have been very difficult because I was going against the grain. It wasn't really like that. I was at school and did what you did when you were at school. I did sport, more sport than learning, and I enjoyed the sport and met some very good people, and I have some permanent friendships from my school days, 50 years later. Some of my closest friends were at school with me. So I think we should be careful not to kind of stereotype, if you like. In your life's journey, you have many influences. And I must say, I remember one of my stronger influences in my life was an Afrikaans teacher at Jan van Riebeeck, who introduced us to Breiten Breitenbach and Andre Brunk and, opened our eyes. Not everyone's eyes get opened. So it depends on all the other influences in your life as well. But there we are. I did my schooling at Jan van Riebeeck. Probably the other big important thing that happened in my life was that after completion of my then compulsory military service, I went traveling. I went abroad. I didn't really have much money. I borrowed a bit of money. And so that was my first real traveling experience on one of these passenger liners, sharing a small cabin with 4 people, and traveled to England. And from there onwards, I spent 2.5 years just doing various jobs, working my way around because I didn't have the luxury of moneyed travel, if you like. But the working and traveling was the experience, obviously. Came back, obviously, with different views of the world. That's what traveling does. That's what exposure does. And don't know how much detail I'm supposed to go into, David, but yes, at the end of the day, oh, by the way, I did end up farming in Magaliesburg before our arrest. But the farming was probably because somewhere along my travels I spent time on a kibbutz. And I loved it. I really loved it. Then I met Trish when I came back to South Africa. We got politically involved. We started farming in Magaliesburg. We were farming quite seriously, small-scale farming. And yes, you're quite right. When the Brands opened the then Mount Grace Hotel, we were farming directly opposite. We sold them yogurt and creams and jams, etc. And then, of course, the rest is a bit of history. In 1983, we were arrested, spent time in prison. Probably the farming experience, unplanned, led to my becoming eventually the first Minister of Agriculture.
Yeah, that's when we first, I met you slightly before that, but really seminal times.
Indeed.
Looking back, you were, I think, incredibly privileged to be part of Nelson Mandela's first cabinet and that time and that environment. Just give us an idea of what that was like, rubbing shoulders and being part of people like Jay Naidu and Kada Asmal, and that spirit and time that really, got this country really re-energized and I think off to a great start.
Look, I think it was a great start. I think it was a profound experience, if you like. You've mentioned some of the names that I was with. There was a good team there, but in particular, the best member of the team was the leader of the team, Nelson Mandela himself. So it was an enormous privilege to have served under Nelson Mandela, to have experienced his humility, his leadership, his wisdom on many occasions. And many people tend to think of Nelson Mandela as just being a sort of a titular head, if you like. He was just a figurehead. Yeah. Quite the opposite. He paid attention to detail and he expected detail out of us. So we were driven, we were led, and it was a kind of an inspirational leadership and a very inclusive type of leadership. So there was team effort, in fact, including the fact that there were there was more than one party represented in that first government of national unity. Mm. The IFP was there, the National Party was there, but we worked together and we worked well. And partly because there was a leader that could really hold it all together.
Yeah. And, moving forward, you've come back into cabinet with President Ramaphosa. There is, I think, a sense of optimism, a sense of possibly a new beginning. What's it like being in President Ramaphosa's cabinet? And perhaps some thoughts on the sort of macro economy before we delve into more detail around tourism.
Now you're making it quite a loaded question, but okay, I'll deal with it. Thanks, David. Well, interestingly, actually, it's the experience now being brought back into cabinet under President Ramaphosa takes me right back to those days, because I worked in the Thuli House, or what was then Shell House. Yeah.
That's when we first met, I think.
Exactly, when we were engaged in this very intensive policy process. Yeah. And I met you, amongst other things, at Premier Milling, and we were dealing with some of the food security issues and agricultural policy. But the fact of the matter is, our leader then, apart from President Mandela, was Cyril Ramaphosa, who was the Secretary General of the ANC. Yeah. And so he was the leader in Shell House, if you like. And, that was a period of engaging with society, business, labor, civil society, as part of the policy process, if you like, and what we called then getting ready to govern. And in a way, we're experiencing a bit of the same now. From a period when we we actually did drift away from that. And there was an increasing disconnect between ourselves and the various sectors of our economy. I'll get onto your economic question in a moment. And of course, with very bad consequences, because a governing party needs to govern on behalf of the people and represent the people and act in the best interest of the people. And I think we drifted dangerously away from that. And so that's history. But I think with the inauguration of President Ramaphosa and some of us having been brought back to cabinet, it is a kind of a new dawn. It is a new beginning, and there is a lot of excitement. And we're getting to grips with the real issues once again, but in the right way as well, in a consultative manner. I think for me it's great to reconnect with industry leaders in the tourism sector and to know I have that encouragement right from the top, and that my colleagues are doing the same thing. And so, yeah, it's a new exciting period, if you like. I'm not quite as young as I was in 1994, but I think I'm equally enthused. The state of the economy, well, it's not what it should be. And it isn't going to be what it should be in a matter of weeks or a matter of a few months, because we did let it slip. And there are many contributing factors, but at the same time, it's highly recoverable, and that's the important thing. So, and as an essential ingredient for its recovery is policy certainty, but not just any policy. So get your policies, get people to buy into and embrace your policies and to be part of policy-making processes, create the certainty, and that's a critical precondition for investment. And we know that President Ramaphosa, not on his own, with business leaders, with labor, has been out to get this $100 billion investment over the next 5 years. And we are compelled to be part of it. So when I spoke about Nelson Mandela being not just a sort of a figurehead, but driving us, President Ramaphosa is doing exactly the same thing. David, when I presented my budget vote, as I was preparing it, we got the instruction from the presidency. You, all of you in the key economic sectors, you've got to include a part in your budget speech on how we're going to attract investment to South Africa. How is tourism, what do you need to do to make tourism help our economy grow? What are you going to do to help tourism create jobs? And so, you know, it's good to operate under that pressure, but it's also good to have a person who really gets it, who really understands the value of tourism. So our budget votes, budget speeches were preceded by, I know I'm going into too much detail, perhaps, forgive me for that, but our budget speeches were preceded by the State of the Nation address, where President Ramaphosa made some very important statements on tourism and the importance of tourism, the value of tourism, but gave us a very polite instruction. Deal with the regulatory barriers. Deal with it and tourism can quite literally shine. Those were his words.
Yeah. Well, look, we'll get on to some questions about those barriers, but before we do, I think one of the useful things that you've done, and it was done very quickly after you being back, was to set up the Ministerial Leadership Forum, which brings together all of the big tourism associations, leadership in the sector, but also all the key public sector senior executives. And you provide a forum where anybody can raise an issue, but if you raise an issue, substantiate it. Why is it important? What should we do? What does the solution look like? And one of the key topics that came up, which I thought was probably long overdue, and we've probably been remiss collectively in not engaging in it, is a discussion around the philosophy of tourism. What do we want? Do we just want to count more numbers, or are we after particular receipts? Can you perhaps just speak to that and some of your thoughts on that, particularly possibly with respect to looking at the Chinese market, for example, which inherently has the potential to give us big numbers, but how do we cope with that logistically? Are we equipped to do so? But your thoughts perhaps just broadly on the philosophy of tourism and where we should be going with that.
Well, interestingly, I mean, in our first, you were there, and some of your members are part of what we now call the Tourism Leadership Forum. At the first meeting we had, when we said, what are the kinds of issues that we should be looking at? And somebody said, but why don't we look at the bigger underlying philosophy around tourism? I have the benefit of not having read their paper yet, because two people undertook to compile a paper. Maggie was one of them from SA Tourism, and Martin from Tourvest. And the two of them undertook to prepare a paper. I've not read it. But I think, you know, your questions are very pertinent, because, you know, we can't be everything to everyone. We've got to do the right things in order to grow the numbers and target the right markets, if you like. But I think the National Tourism Sector Strategy lays out a good framework. So it's not only about marketing and which markets we target and what the underlying philosophy behind that is, but there's a broader philosophy of, you know, how do we get tourism to grow? What do we need to do? And with an underlying value in it, that it should be inclusive growth. It should be sustainable and it should be inclusive. So that sort of underlies all of these key components of a strategy. In short, because I think most of your members would know it. But basically it's again, you know, destination enhancement, destination planning, improving the experience constantly, making it a more profound experience, doing the various things that enable you to achieve that, marketing your product, marketing it successfully, and that implies a research-based marketing and understanding which markets you want to target and why. And then fourthly, apart from the transformation component, making it easier for people to come to your country. And I think, you know, as long as and then of course the fifth one, which should be part of all of it, is to ensure that the growth that would ensue out of implementation of these pillars is an inclusive growth. We'll get back to that later, I'm sure. But the, you know, we obviously, the bulk of our 10 million or so tourists who come to South Africa, 70% come from our immediate neighboring countries. We don't need to do an awful lot or anything to have people come and visit us from our neighboring countries. It's also not what people typically think of as tourism, although by technical definition, most of them who spend more than 24 hours in South Africa are tourists. Your members want to fill their restaurants, they want to sell their goods, they want to sell their services, they want to fill their hotels and their guest houses. And to get that, obviously we need tourists who come here as more typically tourists. And so, you know, it obviously is of value to us if people come to South Africa willing and able to spend more time here and to spend more money here. But that shouldn't be the thing that drives us. We've got to have a tourism that targets many different markets. And I think that could be our strength. It's a long-haul destination, and so we shouldn't be focused on single niche markets, if you like. We should look at a variety of attractive features that our country has to offer to a variety of buyers, if you like, out there, a variety of customers out there. And I think that is our real strength, is precise. I mean, we do have safaris, we do have Cape Town, we do have Table Mountain, but we have so many other things besides. So there's so much that we can use to attract many different people from different countries. China, you mentioned, well, let me pause for a moment. China is very important, but you might want to further elaborate on that.
So talking about China, there has been a certain questioning of whether we should pursue the Chinese market in a more robust fashion. A lot of people see the volumes historically that we've got out of the Chinese market as being very low margin, sometimes sold below cost, revenues clawed back through diamond sales, questions of disintermediation, of ownership and money flowing offshore. Should we be pursuing that market robustly, or is there perhaps a better balance, and should we possibly be focusing on our more traditional markets?
Well, David, our traditional markets are obviously very important to us. In a sense, one could say that any country that sends any number of tourists to South Africa, we value, and every country is important to us, but we don't have all the resources in the world. We've got to be targeted with the resources we have, and we've got to target the higher potential countries, or source markets, if you like. SA Tourism is doing just that. I think their constant research and analysis of where lies the potential, what do we need to do to exploit that potential, I think it's very useful. Their approach is fundamentally sound. But to give an example, I mean, if you take the UK as our biggest single source market at the moment, you know, have a 10% increase on the UK and it makes a big difference. Yeah. Have a 10% increase on Venezuela, it doesn't really make any difference at all. Doesn't mean that the Venezuelans coming to South Africa are not important, but those traditional, especially big source markets, are extremely important to us and will remain so. Very, very encouragingly, before I get on to China, is what's been happening in some countries in the world, and what we saw in 2017. France in particular, incredible growth. Canada, USA, Germany, very good growth from those countries. Phenomenal growth, albeit from a lower base, from Brazil, 75% growth from Brazil. Russia, also a lower base, 52%, and there's a lesson in that. We can get back onto that later. But the main point is that, you know, we do what we need to do, but we have limited resources, and we concentrate our efforts in areas, countries that do have this growth potential or existing potential. China is clearly the country with by far the greatest growth potential. But India doesn't lag far behind, I should say that. So both China and India are in our top 10 source markets as we speak. We look at 3 countries that we believe have huge potential for growth, that are, all 3 of them are inhibited by largely, but not only, by visa requirements. China is one of them. So China, it's not a good news story in the sense that we are lagging far behind where we should be. So we got just under 100,000 tourists from China last year. India, more or less stable, but it should be increasing. And the third country that we believe has good growth potential is Nigeria on the African continent, and it declined in 2017. And all 3 of those countries, not coincidentally, are visa-requiring countries. China, at the moment, the whole world regards it, for good reason, as the huge potential source market, if you like, with 131 million Chinese traveling abroad last year. That's a huge number. Some predict that by the year 2030, there might be as many as 300 million Chinese people traveling abroad. At the moment, we're getting, Australia gets more than 1% of the 130, or approximately 1% of the 131 million travelers. We get less than 0.1% coming to South Africa. So the growth potential is high. And so we clearly have to target that market, which is exactly why I am speaking to you on a screen today and not being with your audience and with your delegates where I wanted to be, because China is so important to us. Our discussions with our Chinese counterparts, critically important, and doing some of the necessary things in order to increase the numbers and the volumes from China will make a huge difference. We believe, I spoke to the Chinese ambassador, and he said we can get 1 million tourists from China, and if we do some of the right things. And the right things: ease off the visa restrictions, make it easier for people to get visas, address the perceptions of crime and the reality of crime. We can get back to that in a moment. And those are the 2 big things. Obviously, direct flights would make a difference as well. But then I asked him, 1 million tourists by when? What's your sort of time frame? In 20 years? In 5 years, he said. I'd like to do it during my term as ambassador. And I think it's doable. I think we can do a lot more than that. If we can get 1% of the 300 million travelers by 2030, that would mean 3 million, am I right? 1% would mean 3 million Chinese tourists to South Africa. We wouldn't be able to cope, quite frankly. Yeah. But the fact of the matter is there's massive growth potential. We've got to address the visa issue. In fact, in addressing the visa issue, we could get growth from many other countries for that matter. But China is the big growth potential country. India, I believe there's also very big growth potential. The issue with India is, I think, primarily, well, 2 things. I think it's primarily also the difficulty Indians are experiencing in getting visas, the time it takes to process visa applications, and of course a direct route from Mumbai to Johannesburg, as we had once upon a time, would help enormously as well. In Nigeria, people are having untold difficulties getting visas. And so they're not coming to South Africa because of fear of crime. Many people, many, as they indicated to me, tour operators when I was there, they would love to come to South Africa. We are just making it so difficult for them to come here. So that's also a big potential growth market.
Yeah. Well, perhaps we could just move on and address some of the questions that we got in from SATSA members, because the key sort of pointed barrier, own goal, if you will, is issues around the visa regulations. And I think perhaps just if you could share with the delegates just why, for the average man in the street or the average operator or the person in the industry, people look at this and say, why is it taking so long? I remember having this discussion with your predecessor, with Minister van Schalkwyk, India visa processing times, and that was nigh on 5 years ago. Is there a sense of urgency under the new president to really expedite, to really accelerate the process, and perhaps just share some of your thoughts on that with us?
Well, there's a sense of huge urgency amongst the recently appointed minister, or within the newly recently appointed Minister of Tourism, because I think we were making some kind of progress at the time, and then it's sort of ground to a halt. And so I would treat this as my biggest single priority over the next period. There are many other things we would like to do, but I think just making it easier for people to come to South Africa lies within our own powers.
Indeed.
There are many things that, are factors beyond our control. We didn't plan the drought in Cape Town.
Yeah.
Before that, we didn't plan the Ebola outbreak, which we didn't have in South Africa anyway, but there was a reaction to it. But we are in control of the visa process. So we're having very robust discussions at the moment between ourselves, the Department of Tourism, and myself and my counterpart, Minister of Tourism, Minister of Home Affairs, excuse me, Minister Gigaba. And, it's taking on a new momentum. And in a way, it's going beyond where we were in 2016. In 2016, we focused on the unabridged birth certificate primarily, and then we agreed on the establishment of these visa facilitation centers, etc. Well, it's not enough. Let me start off with the visa requiring countries, and even one step back, because in truth, we should be doing a scan of all countries and a review of whether countries need visas or don't, whether we're satisfied with the current dispensation. So arguably, a lot of the countries that need visas today shouldn't really need visas. So we're going right back to the drawing board on that. So of course, if the outcome of that, which will happen in the next few months, if the outcome of that is that certain countries that currently need visas will not need visas, then the question of moving to the next step of e-visas, etc., doesn't arise for those countries. But on the assumption that some countries will require visas, and that will be the outcome of discussions with security people, etc. And there's no country in the world, I don't think, or not many countries that would not require visas from some other countries. So on the assumption that certain countries will require visas, the big challenge is to make it a lot easier for them to get visas and a lot faster. And of course, the way we're going, and our discussions with the Department of Home Affairs are quite encouraging, because they seem to share the vision of migrating towards an e-visa system where there's a simplified e-visa application process issued quite rapidly, and with the biometrics, no more in-person visa application processes, no more need for visa facilitation centers, biometrics on arrival. So that's where we want to go to. And I know that's where the Department of Home Affairs wants to go to, but we've got to help them get there. So that's where we are at the moment. But in the interim, I think the measures that they have announced, for example, in China, and especially affecting those three markets that I mentioned, China, Nigeria, and India, recognition of existing and valid visas for countries like a Schengen visa, US, Canada, Australia, UK. If they have valid passports with those valid visas still in their passports, that would be sufficient. They wouldn't need any additional visa. And that would make a big difference. You think so? You think it would make a big difference?
I mean, the New Zealand situation as well, if we could
reverse that.
that would be great.
I think the principle, I'm glad, sorry David for interrupting, but I'm glad you raised New Zealand, because it's a good case study. The approach towards the decision making regarding visas should not be a sort of a tit for tat. Because they need a visa from us, we'll demand a visa from them. It doesn't work that way. We must do what's best for us. So the introduction of a visa requirement for New Zealand had devastating consequences. In the year preceding that, it dropped in 2017, declined by 24%, while Australia was growing.
Yeah.
And there was no reason other than the visas. And then, of course, we mentioned Russia. The 53% growth or 52% growth from Russia happened after the visa waiver was introduced. So Russian travelers to South Africa as tourists don't need visas as we speak.
Yeah, absolutely. Moving on, what about just a quick update on the unabridged birth certificates? It's always the burning question that I think characterises a lot of tourism. It's almost become the sort of poster child, if you will, for some of the sort of new conversations. Any light at the end of the tunnel in the short term on unabridged birth certificates?
I think so. I have committed myself publicly to be pushing for it very hard. Minister Gigaba was with me when we jointly agreed that we could address this issue within weeks rather than months. Well, a few weeks have passed already. I've committed myself publicly to try to get an agreement from the Department of Home Affairs by the end of this month, the end of July. We have prepared all of our recommendations in line with the Cabinet decision of 2016. So these are not new recommendations. The unabridged birth certificate requirement for travelling minors affects primarily, David, the countries that don't require visas. It's not that it doesn't affect countries requiring visas, but for a country not requiring visas, that becomes the difficulty. Other than that, it's really easy to come to South Africa, but not easy if you're a single parent traveling with a child. Not easy if you're if you're a guardian or if you're a relative of a child. And while understanding the concern about child trafficking, there are other ways of dealing with it. So at the moment, it requires an amendment to the regulation. We have proposed regulations that will not compromise our efforts to combat child trafficking, that will bring it in line with what the UK, Canada, and other countries do, where we would strongly advise parents traveling with single parents, for example, traveling with children traveling on their own, to carry certain documents with them. At the moment, it's a requirement, it's a must. They must carry a bundle of documents, some of which are very difficult to obtain, especially if you have a last-minute call to come to South Africa. You might be included in a delegation coming to a conference. You may have a family crisis in South Africa. It happened to me with a family member of mine, and there was untold difficulty getting not just the letter of consent from the other parent, but in particular the affidavit, the sworn affidavit, and that parent wasn't in the UK at that time, and there was a crisis. And so those are the kinds of issues. We have formulated our proposed changes. We're in a very intense discussion with the Department of Home Affairs. At the end of the day, the President wants to see progress on these issues. He was the person who was chairing the Interministerial Committee in the year 2015-16 when we came to these agreements. Now it's implementation time.
Well, we wish you good luck. We know you have the interests of the industry at heart, and we really, just holding thumbs that can be expedited. Another issue that is really quite vexing at the moment for our members, and really seems to be one of the worst own goals that we've come across, is vehicle permitting and licensing. We had a provincial system that creaked and groaned. It worked well in certain provinces. It was a nightmare in others. We all looked forward and we all welcomed the advent of the National Public Transport Regulator. But unfortunately, in the way it's been capacitated and certain inherent systemic issues, this has actually become a new major bottleneck. And it's that international competitive playing field. We're up against the Aussies, we're up against New Zealand, we compete against Brazil, and these countries don't seem to be imposing this level of sort of onerous impediments for businesses simply to be able to operate competitively. Any insights or some views on how we could just try and get over this little hump that we've got?
I think, David, in your interaction with your members, I dare say that you have more information than I do, but it's come to my attention as well, including through your own office, if you like. We have, amongst other things, we also have a newly appointed Minister of Transport. I have already begun a process of setting up a meeting with my colleague, Minister Bladen Nzimande. So we have a meeting coming up in a few weeks from now. But in the meanwhile, the departments are working very closely together, and they have a task team looking at all of these issues, a joint task team. I've not yet had a report back from the task teams, but they are obviously very intensely or acutely aware of the issues that you raise. That is my job as a Minister of Tourism. I'm glad you're bringing all these difficult things to me, because that's what you want of a Minister of Tourism, to, in whatever way he or she can, to take up your interests with, because a lot of the time it's not necessarily within the powers of the Department of Tourism. It requires cooperation from another minister somewhere else. And our job is to represent the interests of the industry and to engage with those counterpart ministers. I think that there will be good progress. I think the relationship between myself and my colleague, Minister Nzimande, is a very good relationship. The departments are working well together. So I would envisage in the next few weeks that there'd be some positive report back on these very difficult issues that you're talking about, including the state of the roads, I should say, David.
As well. Yes, the quality of roads in Mpumalanga.
Absolutely.
I was up there recently, and I mean, it's one of those. There's so much that's great about our country, and one feels so proud as being a South African. It was one of the few times I felt quite ashamed. I felt ashamed because the quality of those roads, and it's fine if you're a local, everybody's a bit savvy. You're a 70-year-old German self-drive traveller. It's summer, there's a thunderstorm. You don't see those horrendous potholes. And I think it's not only that we do a disservice to a great part of our country, that we should be encouraging geographical spread and getting people up there, but it really possibly is an accident waiting to happen. So it's really encouraging to hear that that's on the agenda as well, and that we can. And I think there has been a lot of really good work done by Kruger Local Tourism. I think they've engaged at a provincial and local level, because it can't always be we can't always ask you to sort of be the sort of parachute the commando in to solve all these problems. We've got to actually work where the rubber hits the road, quite literally.
Absolutely. I mean, one thing that the way we project ourselves as a country, and in most of our country it would apply, and that we're a country with a good infrastructure. We have good airport facilities, good airport infrastructure. We need to do something about the queues, but when we simplify the process, we'll also reduce the queues. But we by and large do have good infrastructure, and we sell our country as a country that has the big five, has the wildlife experiences, and you don't need a 4x4 to get there, which not every country can boast of. You can go there in your sedan. And so we are deeply concerned about the state of roads in Mpumalanga and access to our biggest national park, and that is the Kruger National Park. And we should be concerned. But the good news is that there's really good discussion with the Mpumalanga provincial government at the moment, because these are provincial roads and they take responsibility. Because tourism is so important to them, I think they've really got it now. If you don't fix your roads, it will seriously impact on your own tourism growth in your province. Of course, in other parts of the country, we're not necessarily seeing deterioration, but the state of the roads does prevent the full exploitation of tourism potential. For example, Wild Coast. Yeah, a good example. So I think again there the MEC for Economic Affairs and Tourism, I think he gets it, and they want tourism to grow. They see it as a growth area, but they will have to invest in infrastructure to facilitate the growth in those areas with high potential growth.
Great. Minister, you're not able to be with us, obviously, as the morning unfolds. We've got a really interesting program, and one of the key sessions we have scheduled this year is on transformation. It's an important issue. We dealt with it last year in the conference. What we're trying to do in this session is make it a practical learning session for SATSA members. A lot of our members are small owner-managed businesses. A lot of the members of SATSA realize the imperative for inclusive growth. But as a small tourism business, what's my role? How do I play in this space? What is expected of me? And just some general thoughts around the transformation issue, if you could share those with us.
Yeah, well, thanks, David. I mean, it's obviously something that we could spend a long time discussing. We had a special session with the Industry Leadership Forum, and it was very encouraging because it's a collective effort. We have a Charter Council. The Charter Council has done a scan, a landscape scan, and we know the state of transformation is not exactly an inspiring story. So we know we still have a long way to go. What is encouraging, though, is that it's not something that it goes beyond just score sheet, and people get that and they embrace it. Obviously, the bigger hotel groups, the bigger businesses are critically important, so they can do certain things that a smaller business cannot necessarily do. And those things that they could do, but the first thing is to realize that this is an imperative. And I think that realization is there. I think more so now than it would have been the case a couple of years ago. Bigger businesses can use their procurement abilities, their procurement powers, their supply chains are the potential entrance into the tourism sector. You know, the smaller businesses that, black-owned businesses, that could be the suppliers of the many essential goods and services for the tourism sector, and that could be a good entry point. You know, hotel groups have, not only are the receivers of customers, but they're the senders of people. You know, from their reception desk, from the concierge, they tell people, often it's them who tells people where they can spend their day, what they can visit. So that itself is a transformation opportunity when they can tell their customers and their guests that they should include township tourism. And very often there'll be some kind of fear and say, but is it safe? Well, they've got to make sure that there's a package available that they know is safe. So that's one part of it. Every hotel group, every guest house, every bed and breakfast, every restaurant has to reflect upon itself and say, is this a welcoming environment to black customers, black guests, black clientele? And if it isn't, then there's something wrong. And you've got to make it a welcoming environment. It's in your economic interest to do so. It's in your business interest to do so. But as proud citizens of this country, South Africa, wanting our country to be a better country for all, we all have to make our own contributions to bring it there, and we'll all benefit, actually. So it'll help bring stability to our country. It'll help deal with these enormous challenges of poverty, unemployment, inequality, and so it's a collective effort. And my message to your delegates, to you, dear delegates sitting over there, is wherever you are, however small your business is, there is something that you can do to make a difference to many people in our country. There's something in your corner of the world that will be something special to somebody or some small business trying to get a foothold in the industry. You can make a difference. You've just got to embrace it. And you've just got to ask yourself every morning, apart from what I need to do to grow my business, what can I do to make my business help other people so that my business is something that contributes to Project South Africa?
Thank you, Minister. Yeah, no, really, really inspiring. You've spent a lot of time, or we spent a lot of time grappling and quite necessarily with some of the obstacles. But talk to us about, from your point of view, what are the opportunities? We are looking at some arrival stats that aren't looking that positive from the inbound side, but I think there's some really good reasons for that. But it would really be nice to focus on some opportunities and some more positive news.
Well, insofar as your delegates may have had something to do with it, it's great that the drought has finally broken in the Western Cape, and I think it has finally broken. I don't think the day zero concept was a useful one, because and it did have a profound impact on tourism numbers in Cape Town, because people, sometimes for good reason, people said, but do we want to be part of the problem? Do we want to contribute to the problem? Maybe we should rather not visit Cape Town. Not only international visitors, domestic tourism as well. But the other part of it was, do we want to be in Cape Town when day zero arrives? So basically our dams are filling as we speak. So that's a bit of good news. The good news from our side to you, David, is that we are systematically addressing some of the more difficult things that you raised with me. Good news, there was good news in 2017 from many of our source markets. I think 2018 is not going to be the year that we'd have liked it to have been. There's going to be impact of the drought and other factors, but I think 2019 is going to be a great year. I really do. The country South Africa, which is what we're selling to the world, the many parts of South Africa which we are selling to our domestic tourists, see more of your own country. It's very much part of our message. See it, feel it, experience it, do a short left, and whatever else. I think we should all be marketing South Africa, and we should all be doing our little bit, and I know your members are doing it, doing their little bit to make the tourism experience in South Africa a great experience. Some people come and visit a country because they want to stay at a particular resort or at a particular hotel. And you know, that's what you have to do. You have to do your utmost. We'll help you where we can to make the experience a better experience. I think it's more than just the hotel experience and the restaurant experience. I think what we're doing to assist in guiding, for example, that visit to Robben Island, that visit to Mapungubwe or Marupeng has to be a more profound experience. Back to the Chinese market, I think having more people speak Chinese, speak Mandarin, you know, there are many things that we can do together. And I believe that tourism is going to really fly because I think the atmosphere is there, the opportunities are there. I think your members, many of whom I know, and I know it feels a bit odd, you know, speaking to you through a screen, but I really do wish I could have been with you today. But I think your members are, as I know them, they love South Africa, they love their business. All we have to do is to kind of get the best out of everybody, and tourism can really make a big, big difference in many people's lives in South Africa.
Well, Minister, thank you so much for your time. We wish you well in your deliberations and engagement with the Chinese. And I must say, from all of us, it's really great to have you back at the helm. We are really supportive of your leadership and look forward to the time ahead. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, David. Thank you.